Audio check. Good afternoon, everybody. Right, the inquiry's now resumed. It goes at the point where I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Humphreys.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Chapman, you told us at the beginning of your evidence about your experience, and so that there is no misunderstanding, you don't have experience or indeed expertise, as I understand it, in forecasting passenger numbers at either hub or regional airports. Is that right? It can be a yes or no answer. You either have, in which case I'm going to ask you about it, or it's no.
Sorry, which was the yes and which was the no? Which way around was the question phrased?
Try and listen to the question. You told us about your experience before. My understanding, however, is that you do not have experience or expertise about forecasting passenger numbers at either hub or regional airports.
I have expertise about those things, yes. Can I clarify? I do not build the models myself, and as a result, I am not experienced with issues around fleet mix, sort of the micro parameters that determine the model. However, I have made very extensive use of the DFT's Aviation 2017 forecasts over the last
Dr.
3.5
Chapman,
years.
that's a really very different thing. So tell me about a forecast you've done for an airport and where I can find it, and then I'm going to have a look at that over the weekend.
I never said that I had done one, and I haven't.
You haven't done one.
But that's not what your first question was. Your first question was, do I have experience working with forecasts? And
No, my first question was not, do you have experience working with forecasts? You know that. I asked you whether you had undertaken forecasts.
No, you didn't use the word undertaken.
So that isn't, in fact, I'm sorry, that isn't correct.
Have you undertaken forecasts? Have you done forecasts for hub or regional airports? Okay. And I'm not, therefore, going to ask you about the forecasting points in your addendum, as we agreed, and that's going to be dealt with in a slightly different way. In your proof, you tell us about your involvement at Bristol. I think you originally were advising CPRE, and you produced a report and then a follow-up report, and we have those. I'm going to ask you now about your experience in relation to the town and country planning system and development control decisions. I know, you produced a report for the application into the Leeds Bradford Airport expansion, and that made, it wasn't exactly the same, but it made very similar points, didn't it, about Green Book, web tag, displacement, economic benefits, tourism, carbon. And we know that was not accepted and planning permission was granted.
So what do you mean by not accepted?
Planning permission was granted.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Yeah. And for the Stansted inquiry, again, you made very similar points, including the use of Green Book, web tag, displacement, economic benefits, tourism, carbon. There we can see the inspector's report. Your points were not accepted, were they? The inspectors don't say, look, there should have been a web tag or Green Book analysis, and there wasn't, and criticise, and planning permission was granted.
Correct, although obviously I was very, very minimally involved in the Stansted one. I just showed up and made what must have been, I can't remember, but a sort of 10-minute statement as a an external party.
But you produced a report, whatever you said. I mean, the inspectors will look at the report, and you produced written material, didn't you?
No, I don't think I produced written material for the Stansted one. I just put a verbal statement.
I thought the NEF report, which made a lot of these points generally, was one of the inquiry documents. I can check that.
You mean, did NEF made a bespoke report on Stansted
No, you have an NEF report, you have a number of NEF reports which make these points about use of web tag and expansion of airports. I've forgotten the name of the report you often put in.
I haven't put, I mean, somebody might have put a NEF report into the standstill inquiry, but I didn't.
Okay.
I just went and made verbal evidence.
Are there any other either Inspector or Secretary of State decisions on planning appeals that you want to point to which say that the Green Book or web tag approach should be adopted?
I'm not sure why that's necessary when we have the quotes in
Didn't ask that.
the tag guidance itself.
Do you want to point to any other Inspector or Secretary of State decisions on planning appeals that have said that the Green Book web tag approach should be adopted?
I don't want to point to a specific one, no.
Well, are you able to point to one?
So, I mean, my understanding, for example, in the development consent order process that is currently underway for, I think, is it Gatwick?
There's no application under the development consent order process yet for Gatwick.
Or maybe I thought there was not an application, but a scoping report in for also for Luton expansion as well. And my understanding is that that process
Again,
will then
yes.
will have to inevitably be so they'll make a decision on the appropriate method of appraisal. And my understanding is that they will take into account Green Book and tag in that process.
Dr. Chapman, there are thousands of planning applications that go on over time. You have three very experienced inspectors.
Indeed.
I've been doing this for 40 years.
Indeed.
I'm just asking if you can point to planning decisions taken by inspectors or the Secretary of State where they've said, look, to carry out analysis, you have to use web tag or the Green Book. I don't believe there are any.
So my understanding is that you're correct. So if I could just say on that. So there's not thousands of airport examples. There's a very small number, especially in recent years. And I would agree, it's definitely been the case in the last few years, at least since I've been following this. I don't have the legacy of history of, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of lots of applications, obviously. But what I am proposing is that, for example, what happened in Leeds Bradford, what happened in Stansted, and the fact that these guidance documents were not considered or not given importance to deciding what was an appropriate methodology was an oversight that unfolded in those situations, given the very clear quotes that I have put and evidenced in my document. I mean, these quotes are not matters of conjecture. It is absolutely clear that the DFT thinks their tag guidance is best practice. So why an aviation intervention would not be looked at in that context, why the appraisal process would not use that guidance, I find strange.
No, well, we'll come to that. Do you think that might be something to do with your inexperience in the planning system?
Oh yeah, I'm not a planning specialist at all.
No, well, very fair. Now, when you were introduced, almost the first thing you were asked when you were asked about your experience and what you bring to this planning inquiry was that you're an expert in the policy impact analysis, and you said yes. But of course you haven't in your proof of evidence set out any analysis of either national aviation or economic policy, or indeed regional or local economic policy at all.
Yeah, well, in my evidence there, I just focused on the aviation stuff, but can I give an example of my wider socio-economic policy experience?
No. Well, I mean, you can, but...
Well, you just asked me for socio-economic policy experience. I'm just going to share one, if that's okay.
No, I didn't ask you about experience. I said you had got experience, but your proof doesn't mention any of it.
I'll share it now. So the last 18 months, most of my time has been on these airports issues, but NEF also, given the crisis, seconded me into our policy economic unit working on the furlough scheme. And we were looking again at job forecasts and job analysis and the effectiveness of the furlough scheme. We developed a model that we were running throughout the crisis that looked at the effectiveness of the furlough scheme. Now, in about October-ish, the furlough, if you remember last year, was due to come to an end. We used our model to show that the furlough scheme would, if ended prematurely, would cost around 2 million jobs unnecessarily in this country. We shared that document with HM Treasury, and I then had conversations with HM Treasury. And within around 10 days, the furlough scheme policy was revoked and it was extended. Now, the day after that happened, an article appeared in the Financial Times. It was Chris Giles, I believe. And it stated, when, I can circulate this article if people would like, the point being that when the officials considered the evidence, they considered a well-researched report from the New Economics Foundation, which influenced their decision to change a national policy which involved billions of pounds of spending and 2 million jobs on the line.
All right, now let's return to the cross-examination. I asked you about government aviation and economic policy. Do you accept government aviation and economic policy as set out in the various documents we've been considering? Now, we can take this a long way or short way, but aviation policy framework, the future of aviation, the making best use policy, those various statements, the Grant Shapps statement to Parliament, I've taken other witnesses through them. Do you accept that policy framework?
So I'm obviously a critic of a lot of the current government's approach to aviation. That's right. A matter of public record. However, I have endeavoured in my submissions to this inquiry, given the parameters within which it works, to always work within the parameters of existing policy.
That's good. So for these purposes, maybe not inside this public inquiry room, but outside it you may have those views, but here you accept government view that airports are a national asset, their expansion is a core part of boosting global connectivity?
On that particular qualitative statement, I'm not sure I agree. I mean, I accept the government's policy position in the making best use of existing runways policy. I don't necessarily accept as true. I mean, we're allowed to disagree with the government's assessment of the current situation, but I accept the policy and I'm working within the bounds of it.
So we accept the policy and the inspectors should give proper weight, full weight to the policy, shouldn't they?
Indeed.
And the policy, including making best use, that's a policy that, again, for these purposes within this room, you accept should be given full weight?
Indeed. And I think particularly so, given the fact that that policy emphasises the right of local authorities to be the decision maker and to weigh up economic and environmental aspects and to come to their own conclusion as to the relative merits between those impacts. The making best use policy makes no prejudgment of the outcome and no assumption that every expansion will be, beneficial and therefore must go ahead. There is delegated decision making.
Dr. Chapman, if it determined things in that way, we wouldn't be here. But obviously, applicants have the right to appeal to independent inspectors, and they apply the policy in way they think fit. As far as regional and local policy is concerned, again, we can go through all of them. They're all on the CD list if we need to, but I'm hoping that we don't need to. Again, regional and local policy emphasizes, doesn't it, the importance of promoting jobs, employment, and so on in the regional and local area.
Of course.
And it clearly identifies international connectivity, including provided by the airport, as a key theme of strategy.
I can't comment on that because I'm not sure what policy you're referring to, and I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of North Somerset Council's policies.
I was thinking, for example, the West of England Local Industrial Strategy, page 45. Strong international connectivity is provided by the airport.
It is currently provided by the airport, yeah.
All right, well, we won't go through all of those in that case. Local deprivation and jobs, again, I don't suppose you depart from Mr. Ciro's acceptance that the airport is located between two areas with very high levels of deprivation, Weston-super-Mare being one where we are and South Bristol being the other.
The airport is within a number of miles of those locations. However, I have not seen evidence presented of a significant proportion of jobs being accessible by those communities from the airports. And I thought that the economic impact addendum seemed particularly lacking in quality evidence of exactly how its jobs are available to those communities and whether they really are.
Yes. Are you aware of the package of various measures that the airport is putting forward to assist local access through skills education and other things for local people to jobs?
I've only heard of it sort of, rumoured. Someone mentioned that to me, but I haven't looked into the details.
Let's just look to see what the council's own officers thought. Could you have the officers' report, that's CD 4.11?
Yep, got it.
And you just need to turn to page 34. It may be... And you can see the section, the conclusion there, and this is recording the position at that time between the airport and Jacobs, where they accepted substantial net benefits, but there was an argument about the precise figures, so put that to one side. I've discussed that with Mr. Ciro, but the next paragraph. In addition, the expansion builds on the airport's role as a major employer in North Somerset and provides opportunities for job creation and skills development. To secure this, the proposed Section 106 agreement would include provisions that support specialist employment support, scholastic and educational outreach, specific construction phase labour agreements, the rationale being to ensure a systematic, long-term approach to developing resilience and inclusivity within their talent pool and supply chain. Those are important things, aren't they, for local people?
Employment support, scholastic, educational outreach, yes, obviously important.
Yes, and things I assume you would actually applaud. I mean, if the jobs are going to come, you would applaud these sorts of things being offered.
Oh, yes, of course.
Now let's just come to your section 2. This is economic appraisal methodology. And it is a principal theme, isn't it, of your evidence that the economic appraisal should be undertaken on the basis of the Green Book and WebTag.
Yes.
And can we just look firstly at the Green Book? So it's CD 11.55.
PDF looks a bit funky on my computer. I don't know if other people are getting that, but I've got it anyway.
And section 1.1, tells us something about what it's for. You can see about 4 lines down, this guidance concerns the provision of objective advice by public servants to decision makers, which in central government means advice to ministers. In arm's length public organisations, the decision makers may be appointed by board members, where local authorities are using the method elected members. The guidance is for all public servants concerned with proposals for the use of public resources. Now, whatever you may think about other consequential resources, the application involves a private sector development, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why I don't think I ever said that the Green Book was the mandatory guidance. I think I said it was best practice.
And insofar as, I don't know, DFT or anybody else may, in consequence, need to bring forward, as part of general sort of highway improvements in the, sub-regional area, insofar as it's required to, DFT will carry out its own assessment at that point. That's nothing to do with the airport expansion, is it?
It's certainly nothing to do with it. I mean, the issue with that is that the business case for those road enhancements will depend upon the expansion of the airport.
Yes.
So they are two interlinked decisions.
But the WebTag and Green Book applies to that public sector decision. It doesn't apply, does it, as we agreed a moment ago, to the private sector?
Given that the road improvements
Well, is that right, first of all? Insofar as we're dealing with the airport expansion, the decision now, the Green Book does not even purport to apply to that type of development. Is that right?
I can't give you a definitive answer because I'm not a planning law expert, so I don't know the precise legal weight on this. But all I know for sure is it is best practice. And if you were a forward-thinking civil servant, given that the business case for the road depends on the business case for the airport, I would want to see the business case for the airport also being delivered at the government standards, which I think makes quite obvious sense.
So can we agree that there is no requirement for it to be applied?
Not that I've seen,
No.
not on the Green Book that I've seen written down.
And ditto WebTag, that's CD 11.8, we can go to that if you like, but There is
No, I don't agree that there's no requirement for web tag to be applied.
All right, then let's look at CD 11.8. And again, we go to the introduction, and it starts with these words: the appraisal of government interventions in the aviation industry presents some analytical issues which have no close analogue in surface transport modes. This tag unit sets out where tag guidance can be applied directly and additional guidance to cover the estimation of impacts that are specific to the aviation industry. The main user of this guidance is expected to be the DFT itself, and we can all go on and read it. But
Indeed.
this
So the
is-
main user is the government, but not the only user. And as you've just said in the first paragraph, the appraisal of government intervention in the aviation industry, I would strongly consider that approving a 2 million expansion to a capacity limit is an intervention in the industry.
Yes, it's not a government intervention, though, is it? It's
It
a
is. When the
planning-
government makes a decision, when the
government-
inspectorate or the council makes a decision, that's a government intervention.
Okay, so your understanding of the planning system is that local authorities and these inspectors are, in effect, the government.
Local government and an agent of the government, and I understand that there is a scenario where this decision goes before the Secretary of State,
Yes.
who is also a Minister of Government.
Yes, but this is not an intervention by the government. This is a planning application. This is a local planning inquiry.
It is an intervention by an arm of government into a
Okay.
complex national transport system.
All right. Well, look, maybe we leave it like this. I suspect the inspectors who are very experienced inspectors probably know what their role
Indeed.
is. When I asked you before about whether you could point to any decisions where inspectors or government had required web tag to be used, you told me you couldn't.
Indeed. However, if we're agreeing on what our position is to the inspectors, I think we could both agree that it is best practice, given that's directly stated
So-
in this document.
Just to sort of try to crystallize it, when the inspectors look at your evidence, they can note, can't they, that you have come to it on the basis that that the application of Green Book and web tag is required because this is a government intervention?
I have a personal position, and I am not a planning, legal
It
expert.
would
that it seems
help if you could start off with a yes, no.
Just let me just say, there's two things going on here. The witness is being evasive. Answer yes, no, don't
Sorry,
know,
okay.
then qualify. Try not to cut across when you're giving the answers.
Yes, sir.
noted. Please, can you repeat the question?
Yes. Can we characterize your evidence, therefore, when we look at it, that you have come at this on the basis that, firstly, that the application of Green Book and web tag is required?
No. I have come at this on the basis that the application of the Green Book and web tag is best practice,
Yes.
and I have a personal position, but I am not a legal expert, that it seems to me there is a case for web tag being mandatory.
Thank you. In your paragraph 2.2.1, there, which is why I thought this might be slightly easier, you say typically a planning application by a private sector business would not fall under the remit of the Green Book or tag guidance. But you make the point that there are here compelling reasons why this decision to approve the airport expansion does fall within the area where Green Book and WebTag is critical to decision-making. And my understanding generally is that that is because of your views on, amongst other things, climate change.
Yes,
Okay.
at least in part. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, but yes.
What's the other reason, just so I can come back to it?
Well, just that we should follow best practice.
Okay. Insofar as there isn't a Green Book WebTag appraisal before the inspectors, that can't be a point of criticism, can it, in terms of there being any either legal or policy requirement for one?
Sorry, to clarify the question, a criticism of whom?
Of the airport.
Am I criticising the airport?
Yeah, the point I was putting to you is there isn't a Green Book WebTag appraisal. We've agreed that none is required, and therefore there can't be criticism of the airport, can there, for not producing one because it's not required.
I think the airport can be criticised. No. I think the airport can be criticised for not following best practice.
And much of your proof of evidence is devoted to non-compliance with the Green Book or WebTag. I think there are 21 references to the Green Book and 37 references to WebTag in your evidence. It's riddled with it.
Riddled indeed, yes.
In your paragraph 2.4.1, you introduce the peak report, and in fairness, you very fairly said in your evidence in chief that that was a report to government, but it is not government policy.
Yes.
And there again, and we can look at it if you want to, that report also relates to targeted government interventions relating to national regional connectivity and matters of that sort.
Yes.
The report is not directed, is it, to private sector investments or development control decisions?
Yes, it is, insofar as it makes recommendations about appraisal practice, which is relevant to both private sector and public sector decisions.
Well, it doesn't purport to relate it to private sector. It makes it very clear, section 1.1 of the report, do we need to look at it again, that it relates to government interventions?
Yes, although as I've stated before, I consider changes to capacity limits to be a government intervention in the transport network. And I think this report reflects that, because this report is about regional airports. And one of the main ways that the government can alter the regional connectivity system, which this report is about, is by changing capacity limits.
I'll give the reference, you can look it up if you want to. The document is 1146. But section 1.2 identifies what the questions actually were. It says 2 research questions have been posed. How relevant are wider economic impacts in the appraisal of government support for regional air connectivity? And do these impacts vary by the type of government support? Again, this is all about government, isn't it? It's not about
Yes,
a private sector application for planning permission.
The government can support the regional airports by lifting their cap.
Okay. Well, this is your understanding of the planning system, as I understand it.
Yes.
Yes, okay. sensitivity testing, this is your section 3. And again, your points on sensitivity testing are based on Green Book web tag.
Yes, I've established that it is best practice by using reference to those documents.
In this case, we know the airport is applying for some additions, extensions to terminal buildings and car parking, some of the sort of airport apron taxiway systems, and an improvement to a highway junction, and the lifting of a number of, or amendment of a number of planning conditions. But one of the conditions that it's proposing is a passenger cap at 12 million passengers. And so as far as sensitivity testing is concerned, there's no sensitivity around that issue, is there? The cap is absolute.
Yes.
And so the sort of sensitivity we're looking at is whether we reach that cap slightly earlier or slightly later.
Yes, it's true that is the sensitivity that York Aviation have looked at, but that is by far not sufficient for what they should have looked at. They should have been looking at their model parameters and the sensitivities around those in the economic modelling.
But most of the forecasters seem to agree that the growth to 12 million passengers is not going to happen faster than 2030. If it did, we already have a full assessment of that in the original environmental statement, but I think the consensus is that that is unlikely or challenging. We've agreed with Mr. Foley that growth to 12 million is most likely in 2030 in terms of forecasting. And as far as slow growth is concerned, when one looks at that, the environmental impacts actually decrease, don't they, over time?
So is that, can I answer that question, or are you carrying on? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, so in terms of that type of parameter, we're looking at the growth of the airport. I don't think you're challenging that. I don't think that's what your sensitivity point is about, is it?
Yes, you're correct. So I think I've actually said somewhere that so far as the number of passengers is concerned, when you're doing an economic assessment, because a lot of the negatives and positives both move along with passenger numbers, fluctuate with passenger numbers, the question is less about how many passengers, but what is the relative merits or benefits and costs of each of those passengers. Okay.
And what you say in your section 3.3 is, in your experience, and we've discussed that, you've, I think, got experience of 2 airport inquiries previously, the 4 impact areas which relative merits of airport expansion are most sensitive to are job creation. And on that one, and you may disagree with them, but Mr. Brass and Mr. Serro are agreed.
No, I don't think they did fully agree, because they agreed, as I heard it, they agreed on the direct jobs, which are the aviation sector related jobs, but they did not agree on jobs, for example, linked to the impacts of outbound tourism, so the negatives that result from that.
I'll come to tourism, but they've agreed the job data, which is direct, indirect, and induced jobs in the immediate locality, the wider locality west of England, and the regional localities southwest and South Wales.
Yes, I heard that agreement.
Is agreed. Carbon costs, which we'll perhaps touch on, this is your point about what goes into the Monte Carlo modelling.
No, I think actually this is my point about the cost of carbon in the economic modelling is primarily, I mean, it's both, actually, but that's, when I wrote this, that's what I was thinking about.
Business productivity, on that, we've agreed with Mr. Ciro that if the inspectors form the view that the rate of growth of business passengers is half of what we have predicted, then the business productivity gains would be half. If, on the other hand, the business growth is what we have forecast, business passenger growth, then the business productivity would be what we have forecast. Do you remember that was agreed this morning?
No, that was not my understanding of the conversation. I believe Mr. Ciro stood by his forecast that the conservative estimate was zero business productivity benefit.
He had different forecasts. If there's no growth in business passengers, clearly his view is that there is no gain in business productivity. If the growth was half what we'd forecast, the benefits would be half. If we were right about the growth in business passengers, then he agreed our figures. On that, if the inspectors decided that.
I'll have to take your word on that one, because
Yes.
I don't exactly remember the conversation going backwards and forwards.
But that relationship between growth in business passengers and business productivity, which will come to the things that you say later, is accepted between ourselves and Mr. Ciro, for the reasons we've just agreed.
No,
Dr. Chapman, I'm not trying to catch you out here. I'm just trying to put in context where you and I agree and where we have actually managed to reach agreement with the council.
No, because my concern is that, I didn't have a full, I was quite distracted about the fact that I was about to give evidence. I'm not 100% sure what was said between you and Mr. Ciro. However,
Dr.
I do...
Dr. Chapman, stop for a moment. That's absolutely fine. And you only have to say that. I'm not trying to catch you out. It won't bind Mr. Ciro or the inspectors or anyone else. I was just trying to close down and identify where the areas of disagreement are.
So one thing that I know that Mr. Ciro agreed with me on, and I don't actually remember it being discussed really in his your cross-examination, but Mr. Ciro does raise concerns about the Oxford economics coefficient, which is the one that determines that output.
Yes. Which is why, when I put to him that if our business passenger growth is correct, do you get our business productivity? And he said yes, and we covered it more than once. And in his own analysis, where he had 50% growth in business passengers, he got 50% business productivity. That is on the basis of the Oxford Economic 10%, 0.5% relationship, isn't it? Because that's what we use, and that's what he agreed.
I can't speak on behalf of Mr. Ciro.
Okay. Now, your section 4 deals with appraisal geography. And here you tell us that we should have carried out a national level study. We should have used national level study areas. And that again is based on WebTag, you tell us.
Yes.
And that's because WebTag is obviously a governmental national tool, isn't it?
Yes, it is, although they make clear in their guidance, the DFT state that they would use it on any, they use the word any, aviation sector intervention. So I think the implication when they say they'd use it on any is that they would also use it on local decisions.
The Environmental Impact Assessment Regulations 2017 require us to look at, obviously, local impacts of things, both beneficial, economic impacts, but also adverse, noise and other things. And therefore, in the context of our planning inquiry, it's perfectly appropriate, isn't it, for us to have carried out the economic impact assessment based on those more local and regional benefits.
Yes, I was talking, you're right, because I was talking about adding in another study layer, not removing or editing the current ones.
And we, of course, agreed with the local planning authority the scope of the study areas for the economic assessment before the application was made, and there's no criticism by Mr. Ciro of that, is there?
Again, I can't speak on behalf of Mr. Ciro.
And what we have done, which was agreed by the local authority, not challenged by Mr. Ciro, is entirely in line with normal practice at planning inquiries. Unless you want to point to some other planning inquiry, and I'll look at the decision.
Again, I'm not a planning specialist, so I can't comment on that.
Okay. You say that we've failed to analyze the impact on the global climate. We have, haven't we, as required by the EIA regulations, identified the emissions, likely emissions from growth.
Yes, I believe so.
And we...
although, actually, sorry to clarify that, I believe you did not quantify the non-CO2 emissions.
Come to that. We have also set that within the context. So, of course, the inspectors must take into account those emissions, but they must also take into account, mustn't they, the legal and policy mechanism set down by government to control aircraft emissions at a national level.
Yes.
And those are just not up for challenge, are they, at the planning inquiry? That's a matter of legislation and government policy.
Yes, we're not challenging central government policy here.
So when you say at your paragraph 4.1.14 that the local planning authority, or in this case the inspectors, have been kind of left on their own to judge the climate effects, they haven't, have they? The local planning authority and inspectors are given data on the emissions, but they are also given data on the legal and policy mechanisms by which those emissions, together with the emissions of all other UK airports, will be controlled, consistent with achieving net zero in 2050.
Sorry, I struggled to hear what the question was there. Could you...
That is the correct approach. So the inspectors, you say they've been left on their own to judge climate effects. I suggested to you that no, they've been given the data as required by the environmental impact assessment regulations, but they've also been given information on the legal policy mechanisms set by government to control those emissions at a national level, cumulatively, to achieve net zero in 2050. And that's correct, isn't it?
Yes, they have been given they've been given central government policy, if you can call it given. However, that policy is extremely difficult to interpret. It is unclear, and I think that is reflected in why North Somerset Council has sent a letter just recently to the Department for Transport asking a very long series of what I regard to be important questions as to what is going on with emissions policy in aviation. And I suspect when we get to the Climate Change Week, we will uncover quite a significant number of challenging things for the local authority to grapple with.
Yes. Perhaps you and I shouldn't prejudge that discussion, but I don't think you're coming back then. The building blocks of the legislative requirements are clear, aren't they? They comprise Section 1.1 of the 2008 Act. They include the 5-yearly carbon budgets. The first 5 take international aviation into account. The sixth one includes it. They include also the UK emission trading scheme, and all of those matters and how they are operated by government is a matter for government, isn't it? These inspectors are not advising government on that.
Yes.
Let's just turn to displacement. Again, your whole approach here, this is your section 5, is based on web tag. But in your section 5, let's look, for example, at 523, where you're talking about what approach has been taken. You say, this can be more accurately stated as, if 12 MPPA is consented, then 28% of the growth will be displaced from regional airports, and up to 72% will be displaced from other airports. But, Dr. Chapman, nothing in that sense is displaced. This traffic is not at these other airports. If all the airports had capacity, including Bristol, then the 2 million passengers, we know from the forecast, want to come to Bristol, don't they? That's why we get 12 million passengers in 2030. They've chosen Bristol over the other airports in the southwest. Yes?
No, I think your point is that, I think what you're trying to say, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're competing for, these airports are competing for the growth in passengers. That is not necessarily the case. It is possible for passengers to be displaced that are effectively existing passengers that are currently flying today from Cardiff.
But if they were flying today from Cardiff, which has capacity, why are they going to fly from Bristol in the future just because we've amended Condition 68 in the 2011 planning permission? If they like flying from Cardiff, they'll fly from Cardiff.
Because of the addition of new routes. There might be a new route at Bristol which then attracts them over.
Right. In other words, Bristol is offering them something in a competitive market that they don't currently have.
Yes, although I dispute the part about it being a competitive market.
And
it is not a competitive market.
And there's nothing in national local policy, is there, that stops good, successful airports offering good services to passengers?
Yes, there is. We have every single airport in this country has a cap.
Well, I'm not sure that every single airport in the country does have a cap, actually, but a number of them do nowadays. Sorry?
You take the point anyway. I mean, the majority of mainstream airports are operating with a cap. There might be a few regionals, I don't know.
Yes, but very often those caps are set way above their actual throughput. It's not a capacity constraint at the moment for them.
In some cases, yes, but in some cases, no.
But are there any other airports that you're saying by 2030 will be doing less well than they are now? Not seen that in your evidence.
Yes, I am saying that there is a possibility this expansion will reduce, not just recapture growth, will reduce passenger numbers at other regional airports.
But, Dr. Chapman, there's nothing in your evidence about this, or Mr. Foley's evidence, or Mr. Ciro's evidence, or any other data before the inspectors. And you're not a forecaster. That's just kind of made up on the spur of the moment, isn't it? Show me any figures to that effect. Please, now let's go to it.
So there is table, obviously table 2 in my proof, which sets out where in 2030 we expect passengers
That's
to be
20
displaced from.
That's
We-
2030. That's not showing that the passengers at those airports are less than they are now. That's a comparison of where airports might be in 2030. Is there any evidence that you're saying we're taking away not potential growth from other airports, but actual current passengers from other airports?
I'm saying it's a possibility.
All right. So it's a possibility, but there's no evidence of it.
I mean, I don't think it's correct to say there's no evidence of the concept. That's a no. I don't think it's correct to say there's no evidence of the concept of one airport getting expanded, growing significantly, and actually reducing. Interestingly, I submitted in our very first contribution on this matter in 2019. We submitted evidence, and in that evidence we talk about forecasting. As I've made the point before, I have been talking about forecasting throughout my contributions to this inquiry. In fact, can I just refer to that document? Can we just get up the NEF consulting?
Dr. Chapman, yes, of course we can, but
This
isn't a general discussion.
No, but this will provide the evidence that you've just asked for.
Fine, let's look at it. Which document is it?
According to the list you gave me, I'm talking about CD 11.13. CD 11.13. And I'm looking at page 8, table 1.
Page 8.
So page 8, table 1 is the DFT's 2017 aviation forecast outputs for the airports listed there over 2030 to 2040 and 2050. This data from DFT compares without Heathrow expansion and with Heathrow expansion. And as you can see, if you look at the Bristol numbers for 2030, you will see the DFT forecasts believe that without Heathrow expansion, there will be demand for 9.5 million passengers at Bristol Airport. But with expansion, there will be demand for 8.5 million passengers at Bristol Airport. So you can clearly see that not only do the DFT think that there is not as much demand at Bristol as the appellant does, but critically, when Heathrow is expanded, as we've just been discussing, the number of passengers at Bristol falls by 1 million, and indeed, at 8.5 million, it falls below the figure which has already been achieved. I believe the airport has already achieved over 8.5 million before. So what we're saying here is that the DFT believe Heathrow expansion can result in a loss of existing passenger capacity at Bristol.
In the Bristol line, what does the 10 million line mean?
That's the capacity cap assumed.
That's the capacity cap assumed. So obviously in 2017, when they were forecasting this, they were forecasting a constrained airport at Bristol, not an unconstrained airport. So Bristol was never able to go above, or materially above, 10 million in these forecasts. In other words, in any competition with other airports, it's completely shackled.
I mean, no, because there's 1.5 million spare capacity in the Heathrow's example, and there's 500,000 spare capacity in the 2030.
Dr. Chapman, I gave you the opportunity to take us there because I wanted to give you the opportunity to point to any evidence to support your assertion that the growth at Bristol was not just displacing future growth at other airports to some extent, but actually reducing their throughputs. Do you have any evidence in relation to those southwestern airports of that effect?
No. I have not conducted our own displacement model. We are reliant on the other parties. However, I have presented evidence, as demonstrated in this table, that the theoretical principle is possible.
theoretical principle you say is possible, but there is no evidence that it's actually going to happen. Can we agree that?
Yes, okay.
Now, in your table 2, which you took us to, what that's showing is that in the period to 2020, that 2 million passengers choose to fly from Bristol rather than another airport. Yes? That's what it shows.
No, it shows that, 62% choose to fly from Bristol rather than another airport. It shows that 38% choose not to spend money on something else other than flying.
Table 2 shows the passenger change annual in 2030 as being plus 2 million at Bristol. Those are people, this is the expansion from 10 million to 12 million.
Yes.
By 12 million, 2 million people have chosen to fly from Bristol Airport. Yes?
Yes.
If Bristol Airport is capped at 10 million, that is forcing them to either fly from somewhere else that they clearly do not want to fly to, otherwise they would have, or to do something else.
Yes.
The displacement, therefore, is the level at which, it's the level of market distortion that would be introduced by forcing people to do something that they do not want to do. They have to travel further, or they have to pay higher costs, or they have to go to a destination that they don't want to go to because they're not able to fly from Bristol.
Yes, but as I've said many times before, that's commonplace in the aviation sector. Many other airports have caps, and that is the effect of that. But it's commonly accepted by government that that's a fine thing to do.
Well, I don't know that it's commonly accepted that it's a fine thing to do. A lot of airports have caps. I've been involved in the inquiries into a number of them to reflect local environmental constraints, and from time to time those caps are changed. It's not a deliberate policy to cap them in order to force passengers to go elsewhere, is it? In any case that I've ever been involved in.
No, that's not usually the primary objective.
So I'm intervening because I'm concerned that questions aren't being asked, but evidence in fact is being given. We are not privy to all of these other inquiries and able to assess what the considerations were that my learned friend is making reference to. I think it's better to ask witnesses questions rather than to make statements.
If they do fly from another airport, then of course that may create further employment at those other airports, and you discussed earlier that that may be at different rates, but that simply depends, doesn't it, on which airport passengers are displaced to, and we don't know that.
No, we have modelling estimates from your
Yes.
modelers.
And I discussed those with Mr. Ciro this morning.
Yes.
And those are, of course, not jobs that currently exist. We're not taking a job away from another airport. It's just a foregone growth at some other airport.
No. And there's two issues there. One obviously harks back to the thing that we've just been debating about whether or not displaced passengers can be pre-existing. But if you'll let me finish, there's one other key point here, and that is that airports are subject to a considerable amount of automation, which constantly reduces the number of jobs they can hold against a fixed level of passengers. So over time, it requires more passengers to sustain the same level of jobs.
Yes. But we've agreed the number of jobs with Mr. Ciro. We've all taken into account automation and these other things, productivity increases and everything else, and we've agreed the number of jobs. Haven't we?
You and Mr. Thoreau have had a conversation, but that's, I don't see what that has to do with me.
And then, again, your table 3 deals with displacement. And is it the same point that I put to you on the passengers, where I asked you whether there was any evidence that passengers are actually being taken away from other airports rather than foregone growth at other airports, and you said no, there's no actual evidence of that. Ditto the jobs?
I don't think I accept your explanation of what the conversation we just had.
The discussion was whether there was evidence, because I asked you to take me to evidence, and the only thing you could point me to was table 1 in CD 1113, and I sort of kind of pressed you on it. Is there any evidence for these other airports, for example, the airports in the southwest? And you said no. And it's the same if the passengers aren't being, if the passenger numbers aren't being reduced as against today at the other airports, then jobs are not being taken from the other airports, are they?
No, that's not necessarily true. So this table 3 is showing, as we've discussed, the way that different a set passenger number change can result in different responses in jobs at different airports. Now, whether those job changes, those reductions, come from future growth or from existing levels is not predetermined by that table. That table doesn't really make a judgment on either way on that. But I've said before, my position before was that in theory it is possible that some of these jobs would be actual existing jobs. And to add to that point, as I've said, there's this issue that the job productivity of airports is declining over time. So even if they do see some growth, loss of passenger numbers can result in loss of existing jobs.
But, Dr. Chapman, aren't you sort of somewhat postulating a dystopian society in which we force people to fly from airports they don't want to destinations that they don't really want to go to because they wanted, as you told us, to go to a different destination from Bristol? We force them to do that in order to create or preserve, in your case, jobs in those other locations. That's not really a free society, is it? Surely that's a market disruption, that's a market distortion.
That was a very long question, so I'm not sure what I'm being asked to agree to.
What I'm asking you is that what you seem to be suggesting is again, a distortion of the market. We force people to fly from airports they don't want to by constraining capacity at airports that they want to fly from.
Can I address that point first?
Yes.
Because otherwise my brain will lose all the words. No, that's not at all what I'm suggesting.
Right, that's important.
The people are not being, as I said, the principle that a cap can exist is well established. And I am just advocating effectively that we keep to the current approach. So I want people are not being, I mean, yes, the result of it will be that they don't have that choice available to them, but the logical conclusion of what you're posturing there is that we just remove every cap on every airport and have a big free-for-all. And clearly the government doesn't have that policy. There's caps at lots of airports. So it is not a free market, the aviation sector. In your non-dystopian view, I suppose, should I be able to open up a second Bristol Airport on the north side of Bristol and compete for the passengers?
Well, that would
of course I can't
entirely depend, wouldn't it, on the planning balance. That's what we're here to judge. What I'm trying to understand from your view is the way in which you're approaching displacement, which seems to be that we should not cap Bristol Airport because of a noise effect or something to do with the green belt or anything like that, but we should cap it in order to force people to go elsewhere, in order to create jobs elsewhere. And the point I've put is it's just there's no local, national, regional planning policy that forces people to do that. And if there is, point to it.
So, could we take a quick look at the Green Book review again, 2020?
Of course. You'll have to give me the document number, I'm afraid.
So, it was listed on the system as CD 16, on the PDF as 16.4, but I did...
1155, if I'm right.
Green Book Review. I've got something at 16.4. I just give you the warning, Dr. Chapman. This is a Green Book Review. This is not national planning policy. But do take us to what you want to take us to.
We've got the document that we need. I'm just trying to get it back up again. So I'm looking at para 2.24, but the point I think is made quite often throughout this document.
Is it 2.24?
So,
Is it 2.24?
yes.
Okay.
So this again is the government reviewing its approach to appraisal guidance in light of its climate change and levelling up strategic agendas. And there's the quote there: appraisers of proposals must consider the differential impacts on different places and the interaction with other relevant strategies at UK levels or more locally. This will focus minds on how to level up left behind places and help decision makers to see the likely effects of different options on specific geographical areas. Now, I am not here proposing that the entire decision on this airport be made on the basis of the displacement, but I'm saying it is a very valid thing to consider. I think it's very important to consider if we are to align with the government's levelling up agenda, because what I'm describing is differential impacts. I'm saying that there are going to be places that are going to be winners and losers from this, and that we are allowed to consider that in our in the process.
Right. And we can agree, can't we, that places like South Bristol and Weston-super-Mare are important places to level up? Important places.
Yes, I mean anywhere that is worse off needs levelling up. However, the differential point is that the total magnitude of levelling up potential, if you like, is likely to be higher in other places other than at Bristol. There might be more jobs from deprived areas than Bristol Airport can.
Well, if you
The process in aviation of capping capacity.
And Brass's, I think we want his forecasting proof, actually.
Yes, it's in his forecasting, the bit that you're talking about.
So Mr. Brass's forecasting proof, page 52. And it's figure 14. And your
So what page was that, sorry?
point here, page 52, figure 14.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the PDF number. I've
Got it,
the
yeah.
actual. What we see there is overall a rising trend, obviously 2012 being lower. Your point is that there might have been an intervening year, 2004, 5, 6 or 7, that was higher.
Yes.
We don't have the data for that. But what we do have is there, with the exception of 2012, a rising trend for business travel at Bristol, real figures. And what we also know from the discussion with Mr. Foley is that, of course, the 2019 figures are lower than they would have been because at the beginning of that year, BMI Regional, which had a lot of business passengers, collapsed. Collapsed nationally. Now, for the inspectors, it is perfectly reasonable, isn't it, for them, given the data, to see a rising picture, rising business passenger demand at Bristol.
Yes, they can see a rise in this data, but they can't interpret the full picture. It's very likely that the 2006 number was substantially higher.
Well,
As such, we don't know if there's been if it's recovered at all. It could have been higher than 1.1 million.
but you don't know if it's higher. And what we do know, if we look at the McKinsey data, you'll have to remind me where that...
It's an online article, so I think...
Yes, my recollection is that in that data, I did look at it, not only is, I think, 2006, 2007 higher, but the trend continues down thereafter.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean.
What we have here, certainly from 2012, 15, 19, is a rising trend at Bristol. So whatever 2006 was, we have a rising trend at Bristol during those years. What that seems to tell us is that Bristol is performing differently from the McKinsey data.
So I'm just opening up the McKinsey link to check what it actually shows. On. I'm finding that link's dead now, so I might not be able to do that. I'll have to check that later. Sorry about that. Maybe I entered the link wrong.
Can we agree that we're not ever going to be able to recover unrecorded data for Bristol in the year 2006, but can we at least agree that at Bristol we have a rising trend over what looks to be about the last 10 years?
Sorry, just 1 second. I mean, it looks pretty spiky from what I'm seeing here in terms of, you got that peak in 2006, and as a year it drops and then drops again and then drops again, but then goes back up, drops.
I was asking first week. The point I put to you is we do have data for Bristol, and there's a trend. Can we at least agree that? I would have thought it's pretty obvious.
Yes, I mean, I can see growth. 2012, 2019, obviously, I can see that that's grown, but it really matters recovery, or whether that is
have not been tested. And this is based on your web tag Green Book approach.
Yes, broadly speaking.
Yep. And the second reason is that the proposed scheme, you tell us, would present very poor investment from a public interest perspective. And again, that's based on Green Book.
Yes, in part. It's based on a holistic assessment of the various costs and benefit of the scheme, informed by the best practice guidance.
And these are essentially the same type of points that you made at Leeds, Bradford and Stansted, and which were not accepted.
Yes, I guess I probably did make similar points. I mean, again, I don't really see the Stansted thing as an appropriate point of comparison. I spoke for about 10 minutes in the very early phases of that inquiry. My evidence was never interrogated or submitted or anything. So the fact that what I said in 10 minutes there was ignored it's hardly surprising. In the Leeds Bradford, I'm not saying that as an insult to the planning inspector. I just mean, I wasn't a big deal in that. And in the Leeds Bradford case, yes, I mean, we had a lot of exchanges of information, and the council decided to vote in favour of expansion.
Right. Dr. Chapman, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Morehouse,
Thank
do you
you.
want, can you
Yes,
just give me an
please.
idea roughly of how much time?
I think, subject to anything else, probably just 5 minutes.
Oh,
So, thank you.
that's fine.
Dr. Chapman, I just wonder whether you can get go back to the tag unit appraisal document, which is CD 11.08.
Yes, I've got it.
Thank you. If you can have a look at paragraph 1.1.3, please.
Yes, I've got it.
You will see there that the first sentence of that paragraph, this unit is expected to apply to the appraisal of most government interventions in the aviation industry, including individual policies, broader strategies, many regulations, and the approach to planning applications for individual schemes. With that in mind, have you changed your view following the questions of my learned friend, Mr. Humphreys?
Certainly not.
So that's the only question that I have.
I'll just pass over to my colleagues. I've got a few points to raise before we finish. Ladies first. Ladies first.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we've got another socio-economic day on Tuesday. Wednesday to Friday next week, we are dealing with noise. The following week, we'll then go to air quality and health. The timings are looking okay so far, with some free space at the end of the air quality and health week. Hopefully you've all seen today we've sent through a very rudimentary, maybe, conditions comments on the draft list. Obviously noise and air quality are quite technical, and there are some technical conditions proposed as well, and I wondered, best use of inquiry time after the noise and health sessions, whether we could have a very focused conditions session on the noise and air quality conditions, as the experts it'll all be fresh in our mind, and no doubt we'll be sort of talking through a lot of the conditions as well. I just wanted to take thoughts on that now, Mr. Humphreys.
Yes, sorry, I was writing and just want to make sure I've understood that at the end of the air quality and health section, we would perhaps talk about some of the conditions. Was that?
Yeah,
have a session on
the
that?
specific technical air quality and noise
Yes.
conditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we have suggested to the council that we try to have a meeting on certainly the the air noise conditions next week to see if we can sort of thrash things out. Obviously, we didn't know you were going to do that. I think it's been declined. I completely understand because of the evidence coming up, but in an ideal world, it would be good to have tried to resolve some things, but maybe we can do that through your session, actually, and that can, it's obviously a working session in a way, and so that may be helpful. It may help us to resolve things.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Henderson.
Madam, yes, can I just pick up that last point first, please, about the meeting? We were asked yesterday evening for a meeting. We said we couldn't do it in the short term, but at some point during the inquiry process, we would look to fit it in. So I don't want it to be taken that we've shut our eyes to it,
No.
or we're not going to do it. We've said, yes, we will. We just couldn't do it in a very short period of time before we start the evidence. But once we've got some time about witness, then yes, we absolutely will have that meeting.
In fairness, I did say that I thought that was probably because of the availability of the witnesses, and that this might be a good way of bringing things together.
But subject to that, madam, I've got no problem with your suggestion of splitting it up and dealing with it if the inquiry time permits.
Okay.
After the evidence, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Morehouse, for the PCAA, I have a point of clarification, and then I'll come to your view, sir. Your noise witness, Mr. Vaughan.
Yes.
His proof of evidence, so I think it's section 6, references PCAA conditions submission. I've seen a submission from you dated 14th of July, which is sort of an extra column on the table of the council's and the appellant's conditions. Is that the submission? I wasn't sure if it was a different thing.
May I just clarify that, because someone else has been dealing with that?
Okay, yeah.
While it's being done, again, just so I haven't misunderstood,
Yes,
was
it
the
is.
session you were... Well, that was quick.
Sorry.
Was the session you were suggesting, was that just on noise conditions?
It'll be noise and air quality.
And air quality. We
Yeah.
might not have got to the air quality witnesses, but we would...
It'll be after the health session, so it's after
I'm
it
so
all.
sorry. You did say that. I'm so sorry.
No,
I was-
it's very
I was
late on a
thinking-
Friday afternoon, don't
It
worry.
is.
It's been a long week.
I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, I now
Yeah.
understand.
So, Mr. Morehouse, I think you said...
I'm sorry for interrupting, Mr. Humphreys. Yes, it is. Those are the
It
submissions.
is. Okay, so there isn't another document. I just was worried I'd missed something, so that's absolutely fine. Great. And
Unless
then-
you're inviting more, we can...
No. Death by condition, I think that. Okay, and then, so in terms of the PCAA's views on a technical sort of conditions session, as you've had input, would you be agreeable to that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. And appreciate, obviously, next week's the noise witnesses. Is if there's any issues of availability in terms of bringing them back the following week after health's wrapped up for the conditions session, if you can let me know. I mean, obviously, they can join in via Teams, but just sort of, obviously, it's a bit unexpected, so sort of flag that. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, just one point from me. We've probably all noticed that the screens have been changing a bit this afternoon. I'm told that the live stream went down at some point this afternoon, but I'm also told that Teams has been running all the time, program officers watching on Teams. Obviously, no criticism at all, but I mean, if the live stream goes down, that's obviously very unfortunate, but those are obviously people who are simply observing rather than participating. If Teams were to go down, given the nature of this inquiry, and bearing in mind we've got 3 Rule 6 parties who are not physically present, were Teams to go down, I think we'd be looking at an adjournment until it's sorted. Live stream, unfortunate, but probably not so critical in terms of the fairness for the Rule 6 parties. I thought I'd just mention that, as I wasn't quite sure what was happening with the screens either.
So do you happen to know, is the Teams recorded? In other words, if we want to look back at it?
I think not. I don't know. I'm getting a shake of the head from the back, so I think not, and there is obviously an issue there.
Okay.
I mean,
fine.
hopefully it won't happen again, but I just thought I'd make my views clear on the distinction between the two, were it to occur again.
No, really helpful, thank you.
Okay.
So, sorry, could I ask, is it going to go up on YouTube? Has the recording been lost off YouTube?
I strongly suspect that it has probably gone. No, I'm getting a shake of the head from behind me.
No, we're still looking into it. If it can be made available, then we will put it back up. It was intermittent this afternoon, so we lost for 5 minutes, came back up, and the last half an hour or so hasn't been there.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone who contacted the programme officer or myself about that, we've sent the Teams link to. So most people have continued to
Oh, okay.
follow as they were going along.
No, that's useful, thank you. Okay, unless anybody else has got any final comments, we are adjourned till 9:30 on Tuesday. Okay, thank you. Have a good weekend.